All right, welcome. Today, we're going to dive into the really complex, powerful, and let's be honest, often confusing world of family dynamics. We're going to explore what makes a family tick, what happens when things start to break down, and most importantly, how we can find our way back to connection. And we'll be looking at all this through a really fascinating idea called family systems theory. So let's get into it.
For the longest time, psychology was all about the individual. So much of therapy and self-help still centers on that one big question, right? Who am I? But this quote, it points to a pretty revolutionary shift in thinking. It suggests that to really get who we are, we have to ask a much bigger question. Who are we? That one tiny change in pronoun takes us from me to us, from the individual to the family system that we're all a part of.
And that is exactly what this is all about. You see, after the big three, psychoanalysis, behaviorism, and humanistic psychology, family therapy came along as this fourth force. It's a way of looking at the family not just as a collection of individuals, but as a single, living, breathing system where every single part affects every other part. From this point of view, the problem, and thankfully the solution, is usually found within the system itself.
Okay, so before we can even begin to talk about how a family system works, we kind of have to ask a really basic question. What even is a family these days? Because believe me, the answer to that has changed a whole lot over the years. For a long time, the definition was pretty narrow and strict. It was all about blood and marriage. But our understanding has grown. As you can see here, the modern view defines family by its function, not just its form. It's about who gives you that strong, long-term support, whether you're related by blood or not. This is a way more inclusive and, frankly, realistic view of the support networks so many of us rely on.
Now, let's get into what happens when that support system starts to fail. We're going to talk about a word you've probably heard a million times, and it's a heavy one, the dysfunctional family. But let's actually get a really clear definition of what that means.
The crucial thing to understand here isn't just that conflict is happening. It's about a pattern, something that happens over and over again. The whole system actually starts to organize itself around the problem behavior. Family members learn to accommodate it, to walk on eggshells, and maybe the most critical part is that it starts to feel normal, especially to the kids growing up in it.
And this quote just brilliantly nails the core issue. Listen, every single family has conflict. That's not a sign that something's wrong. The real damage happens when those fights and hurts are never resolved. When there are no apologies, when feelings aren't acknowledged, when nobody tries to repair the connection. That lack of repair is what lets all the resentment and distance build up.
So, with all that in mind, let's take a look at some of the common features you see in these kinds of strained family systems. As we go through these next couple of slides, just quietly ask yourself, hey, does any of this ring a bell?
Let's start with communication and boundaries. You might see a serious lack of empathy, where one person's feelings are just consistently ignored or dismissed, or even outright denial that anything harmful is even happening. You see boundaries being constantly crossed. Kids are often taught that they have no right to question authority, so their voices just get shut down. And sometimes it all just collapses into apathy, that I don't care attitude.
Now let's look at the emotional climate. Love might feel conditional, like something you have to constantly earn. Certain emotions, maybe anger or sadness, might be totally off limits. You might see scapegoating, where one family member gets unfairly blamed for everybody else's problems. Then you have these roles, like the absentee parent who's either physically gone or just emotionally checked out. And often, even tiny mistakes are never forgotten. There's just no forgiveness.
One of the absolute most common features is being overly critical. Now, what's really fascinating here is the data. Experts say a healthy emotional climate should have a ratio of about 80 to 90% praise and only 10 to 20% constructive criticism. When that ratio gets flipped, and criticism is the main way people talk to each other, well, it creates a really negative and demoralizing system to live in.
Okay, so we've laid out the problem, and it can sound pretty bleak, but what about the solution? This is where we circle back to that fourth force. This is the path to repair, and it's all about looking at the family as a whole system. The goals of family therapy are actually pretty straightforward and empowering. First, you identify those patterns we've been talking about. Then, you work on building actual practical communication skills. The focus shifts to growing empathy and mutual respect. And ultimately, the real goal is to get back that sense of belonging that's at the heart of any healthy family.
So how does this actually work in practice? Well, the mechanism is beautifully simple. Change really happens in two main ways. First, by making everyone more aware of the patterns they're stuck in. I mean, you can't change what you can't see, right?
And second, by reducing that emotional reactivity, learning to respond thoughtfully instead of just instinctively reacting to old triggers. It's about building a little pause between feeling something and acting on it.
So what does this look like in the real world? Let's talk about some actual, concrete tools and habits that can help build that stronger we.
A fantastic place to start is by setting some ground rules for having a fair fight. So instead of insults or shouting, you agree only one person speaks at a time. Instead of invalidating feelings by saying things like, "You're overreacting," or "You shouldn't feel that way." The rule is all feelings are valid. Then you can talk about the behaviors connected to those feelings. This one shift can be totally transformative.
And you can keep reinforcing those bonds with some simple, positive habits. Things like really valuing shared experiences more than material things, or trying to take some time away together every year, or working on home projects as a team. And maybe most importantly, creating a space where it's okay to talk about negative emotions openly, so they can be processed instead of getting buried and festering.
This quote from a therapist just perfectly captures the whole spirit of this approach. It is not about finding a villain. It's not about deciding who's right and who's wrong. It's a totally non-judgmental process. The only goal is to understand the mechanics of the system you're all in, so you can work together to make it better.
So we'll end this by turning the lens back to you one last time. Thinking about your own family system, whatever that looks like for you. Just ask yourself, who carries the worry? Who's the one that always stays silent? And after a conflict, what usually happens next? Just answering those questions for yourself can be the very first step toward more awareness and ultimately a much stronger, healthier connection.